This week on The Wheelhouse. The ballot. Should Trump be on it? Should everyone have access? For Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. We're going big on all things voting today. Later in the show, we're going to check in on voting equipment in Connecticut and the push to give incarcerated people the right to vote. We're going to start, though, with a big question on many people's minds. Can former President Donald Trump legally become president again? According to folks on both sides of the aisle, the answer isn't exactly clear-cut. From Colorado to Connecticut, there are efforts right now to bar Trump from the ballot in 2024. And the legal argument against his candidacy comes down to one little-known provision in the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. For more on how this could play out in Connecticut and beyond, we're joined by, I'm excited for this guest, Bruce Ackerman, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale Law School and Yale University, and the author of the book, Revolutionary Constitutions. Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning. How are you?
Bruce, I'm really excited to have you on the show because you're not somebody that just kind of sort of follows the news. You're somebody that can make news and pitch stories and tell history in a way that is very engaging and very fresh. So I'm really excited to have you on this morning, Bruce.
Well, thank you.
And folks, if you want to join our conversation, give us a call, 888-720-9677. The phone number to call again is 888-720-9677. Bruce, we're talking about the 14th Amendment. Can you tell me about the Section 3 provision that a lot of people are telling me in the news I should be paying attention to?
Right. Well, it was almost completely unknown, except to a few law professors a couple of years ago. I was one of them. But it was absolutely central at the time of the drafting of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. The basic paradigm person was Jefferson Davis, who, before he was the president of the Confederacy, served as a senator from Mississippi and had taken the oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and then betrayed his oath by engaging in insurrection. He then was captured at the end of the war in 1865, thrown into prison, charged with treason, and was about to be tried and, of course, convicted and killed. That capital punishment was the penalty. But the draftsman of the 14th Amendment instead followed the path defined by Abe Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address, with malice toward none, including Jefferson Davis, and charity to all. Jefferson Davis, no, the only punishment for him is going to be disqualifying him. But it wasn't only Jefferson Davis. The provision was drafted very self-consciously for future rebellions and insurrections. It provides that any person, any officer of the United States, including the president, as Andrew Johnson, who was then president, made absolutely clear in his speeches, if any officer of the United States first swears and uphold the Constitution as an officer, and then engages in an insurrection or rebellion, then he shall be, not may be or can be, but he shall be disqualified from office unless Congress, by 2/3 votes of each house, lifts the disqualification. This is
it's accountability for insurrections, correct?
Complicated and self-conscious set of rules. This is not something that if you read it, it's clear. And please, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No. It's about holding insurrectionists accountable. Then, right? You would say
that's right. Now, so then the question is, what did January 6th constitute an insurrection? Well, it is a paradigmatic act of insurrection. It wasn't a rebellion because it didn't succeed, but it was a paradigmatic act of insurrection in that the capital of the United States was invaded, and if the invaders had found Mike Pence, Mike Pence was in danger of his life.
It's very important. It is very important that you ask that question, though, Bruce, because I think this is what it really comes down to. And as you've been writing about, there are a couple of congressmen who are going to try to help us answer this question, I would imagine, and try to do it soon. Would this help America if we could try to figure out if officially January 6th was an insurrection?
Well, the crucial thing is not going to happen in Congress. It's going to be happening in the states. So, for example, in Connecticut, the Secretary of State is seriously considering, and I very much support this, whether Donald Trump is qualified to run for office, because the Secretary of State has to establish the official ballot for the Republican Party, and he has an obligation to determine whether the people listed on the ballot are qualified to run. For example, if I lived in Oregon and I wanted to run for governor of Connecticut, I wouldn't be qualified.
But this is the tack that you're saying you wrote about this relatively early on too. I imagine right after January 6th. But we're talking about accountability. Maybe the states holding them accountable and keeping them off the ballot versus criminal prosecution. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, what is crucial is this: not Connecticut, but what's happening in Minnesota. Minnesota has a special statute which says that any voter can go directly to the Supreme Court of Minnesota and challenge the qualifications of, in this case, Donald Trump. And last week, 6 voters represented by a very fine public interested group went before the Supreme Court to make this challenge. Now, the laws of Minnesota require the court to make a decision by January 2nd, because that's when the Secretary of State of Minnesota does, as in every other state, has to determine who is a qualified candidate for the presidency for the Republican Party. So the court is going to write an opinion. That means then that we have, then there will be an immediate appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. And it will have 2 months before the trial of Donald Trump begins in Washington, D.C. in March. And during those 2 months, we have a moment of truth. Will the Supreme Court, the new Supreme Court, which claims to be originalist, and that the crucial thing, according to the majority of the justices of the Supreme Court, we have to understand the original understanding of the Constitution and enforce it, because that's the law. I have described to you the original understanding, of course. There's as you mentioned, I've been working on these matters for some time. I was, I should say, the lead witness for President Clinton before the House Judiciary Committee when he was being charged with impeachment. So for decades, I've been investigating the meaning, the relationship, the presidential responsibility, and all this, and been writing about it. And I should emphasize that I have elaborately opposed Mr. Trump's positions on the merits as unconstitutional on a number of issues. But this is more fundamental in running a democracy. And the Supreme Court has 2 months to decide whether Donald Trump is qualified under the 14th Amendment.
And just to reiterate the kind of finer point there, the fact is, if you have those 2 months, if there's a decision by January 2nd, then that gives enough time for us to understand more about January 6th, about Donald Trump's roles in it.
Before we get, I don't want to get confused here. January 2nd is when the Minnesota Supreme Court has to decide the case. Then between January 2nd and March 4th, that's when the trial of Donald Trump begins. You see, so there are these 2 months.
That's a good clarification. Thank you for that.
The Supreme Court of the United States can decide, no, the president is disqualified from office. And that means then that whoever replaces him, and he may well for the Republican nomination, and this may be someone who is just as extreme as Donald Trump, or not, we don't know, and that's not my point. Whoever replaces him will compete with Joe Biden on an equal footing.
We talked about different Republicans and who could potentially replace Donald Trump. But even before we consider that, there's bipartisan support, at least in scholarly articles and some members of Congress stepping up too. There's bipartisan support to disqualify Trump off the ballot. Is that what your understanding is?
Well, there is. I mean, there is indeed very, very broad support, but of course there are people who disagree. That's precisely the kind of thing that we will be that should be considered by the justices of the Supreme Court. I'm talking about this desperate race against time. If Donald Trump is put in, required to stay in Washington, D.C. for 4 months while his opponent is running against him. And there will be, he will, and his supporters will correctly say, this is not democracy. Biden and the Biden administration is using its authority to gain a second term without actually having a fair contest. That's what they will predictably say. And there will be marches, instability throughout the campaign. Mass demonstrations on both sides. This will make the tragedy of January 6th seem only a preliminary to a much more profound tragedy. And at the end of 4 months of this trial, what will happen? Will Trump be convicted, or will he be acquitted? We don't know.
And then let's say that there's consideration of the fact that the Supreme Court, or excuse me, I apologize for that. Let's say that Trump is potentially taken off the ballot, I imagine that there would be challenge to this. What would the Supreme Court step in at any point after that, do you believe? And keeping in mind that, go ahead.
The only institution who has the credibility of disqualifying Trump is the Supreme Court, precisely because it's now a creation. The dominant group in the Supreme Court is a creation of Trump's appointments. So if the Supreme Court decides that the original understanding requires Trump's exclusion, it is credible. Then the Supreme Court's decision is the supreme law of the land, quote unquote, from the Constitution. And every state court, including, of course, Connecticut, has the constitutional obligation to follow it and order their Secretary of State to remove Trump and pursue this throughout the. So it isn't that the Supreme Court will have to intervene again and again and again. Rather, its decision is the supreme law of the land, and every Supreme Court, regardless of the political ideologies of its members, recognize that this is a foundational principle of the rule of law in the United States of America. But you see, if one of the deeper problems here is that Merrick Garland, who is the Attorney General, is, of course, given his history, has acted with extreme restraint. He is, tried very, very hard not to involve the Biden administration and the Justice Department in anything involving the criminal prosecution of Trump, and has delegated this task to a special prosecutor who is an outstanding prosecutor.
Do you envision a world, Bruce, where they've kept and this is going to be the last question. Do you envision a world where they keep Trump off the ballot in 2024? Is this something that's possible?
That is correct. It is not only possible, everyone, this is why I'm emphasizing we should be watching Minnesota, because it is not only possible, they are going to make a decision, and it will be appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is, this is the moment of truth. If the Supreme Court does not try to understand the original understanding that disqualified not only Jefferson Davis, but all officials who had taken an oath previously to the United States, and then engaged in insurrection or rebellion. If they do not do that, they will have led this country down a path of political disaster. Whoever wins in November, the losers will be alienated and embittered. And worse yet, it may well be that both sides in a close election will be alienated, with the Trump supporters claiming that the Biden administration has thrown their great man into it made it impossible for him to run effectively, and has stolen the election, and the Biden administration saying no, the rule of law, et cetera, and so forth.
And Bruce, I want to underscore this, as you said earlier,
tragedy.
And I want to underscore this, as you said earlier. This should be it, you would think. If they rule on Minnesota, they're not going to go kind of state by state. And let's say if Colorado was able to to follow through on this lawsuit that's been filed by some Republican voters, some independent voters. Let's say if they kept Trump off the ballot now, this wouldn't then go a Colorado thing. The Supreme Court wouldn't rule on what's happening in Colorado. You're saying that once Minnesota happens, it should be one decision and then everybody would move forward from there. That's what you're thinking.
That is correct. Okay. Once Minnesota decides and the Supreme Court decides, whatever the Supreme Court decides is the law of the land.
Bruce Ackerman, thank you so much for coming on. Very excited to have you on. The author of Revolutionary Constitutions, Yale Law School and Yale University. Thank you so much, Bruce.
A pleasure.
From Connecticut Public, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're going to look next at the push to give incarcerated people the right to vote in Connecticut. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. All hour, we're going to go big on the ballot. We just heard how Trump could be blocked from seeking the presidency in 2024. And now we're going to pivot to blocking certain people from voting, specifically those in prison. Last week, the Connecticut Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights heard testimony in favor of expanding voting rights to those currently incarcerated. Connecticut, like many states, currently allows people to cast ballots once they are released from prison. But civil rights groups think the state can take it one step further. For more on this, we're joined by Ariel White, Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT. Thank you for joining us this morning, Ariel.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you want to join the conversation with us, you want to talk about folks that are currently incarcerated and potentially getting the right to vote, give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Maybe you want to talk about logistics, other experiences, the people that are formerly incarcerated as well. You can give us a call, 888-720-9677. Hey, Ariel, why do most U.S. states prohibit voting by incarcerated people?
Oh, this is a good question. And I would say the history of introducing felony disfranchisement laws has varied a lot across the states. So in some cases, like in Maine and Vermont, we just never saw felony disfranchisement being introduced. They just never had these laws on the books. People have had the right to vote straight through. In other places, Connecticut introduces this in the early 19th century. Other states have had felony disenfranchisement laws in place since statehood, since they joined the U.S. And then in other places, they're more recently introduced. So, for example, in a number of southern states, we saw felony disenfranchisement laws being introduced during the post-Reconstruction or the Jim Crow era as part of these bundles of efforts to prevent particularly African-American voters from exercising the right to vote. You see state legislators, for example, being fairly explicit on the floor of these legislators talking about this as a potential tool to prevent some people from voting. So it's a real range of histories depending on where you look within the country.
And looking outside the country, would you say U.S. is an outlier on this issue?
Yes, I would, in a couple of ways. So, again, we've got this spectrum of felony disenfranchisement laws across the U.S. But as you start to get into places where people lose the right to vote, in some cases while in prison or even afterwards, sometimes nearly for the rest of their lives, these are not laws that you see nearly as frequently outside of the United States. So in much of Europe, for example, people never lose the right to vote when they're in contact with the legal system. But the other dimension on which the U.S. is an outlier here that I would note is just the scale of our legal system. And so how many people end up being affected by felony disenfranchisement. Because the U.S. puts so many more people in prison, on probation, on parole than most of the rest of the world, we also just see a lot more people getting pulled in and affected by the felony disenfranchisement laws that we do have on the books. So in both those ways, we're an outlier relative to much of the rest of the world.
And then just looking up and following up on those democracies outside of the United States, Are there scenarios in which people can't vote if they're currently incarcerated? Is it by a felony law, or is it by a specific felony? I know we look at violent felonies in America as a line of demarcation sometimes with the way that people are looked at in the justice system. Is that something that we're looking at outside of the United States?
Yes, indeed. This varies by country. In some places, it is very specific types of crimes that are disenfranchising, or types of sentences people might be serving, like the length of sentence, as we see in Australia. In other places, it's a little bit more blanket, like the US. And then in other places, people simply never lose the right to vote at all.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Connecticut lawmakers, they've already allowed people to cast ballots once they're released from prison. So would the state be in a good place, do you think, to extend the franchise even further?
Well, I'm not privy to planning that might have been done by election officials or corrections officials within the state, but certainly after having extended the right to vote on parole, to people on parole in 2021, state agencies, I would say, have had a chance to think through some of the logistics, right, of communicating about eligibility, making sure people have the information they need to access the ballot. Certainly, there are specific additional kind of planning things to consider when you're implementing policies that extend the right to vote to people in prison specifically, since there are just kind of practical questions about how people get the materials that they need to register if they're not already registered, to request a ballot and cast it on time, as well as just how people will get the information that they need about candidates, for example, because of course people in prison often will not have the same free access to information as people outside of prison. So, these are just kind of logistical considerations that places consider as they are implementing a change like this. We saw this in Washington, D.C. recently. It's definitely not an insurmountable barrier. It's just the kind of thing that a state would plan for when making a change like this.
Only Maine and Vermont currently allow voting by incarcerated residents. What do you think Connecticut, any other state, can learn from them? And is this something that's a particularly controversial move when we're looking at what those states do?
Actually, no, that's maybe the most remarkable thing about the legal regime in Maine and Vermont is that this has simply it's not the case that either Maine or Vermont has recently changed their laws to extend the right to vote to people in prison. It's just that they never actually implemented felony disenfranchisement. And so as far as I've seen, this is essentially a non-issue in these states. It's just how things have always been. I'm not aware of major, pushes to change that status quo. We have seen in certain other jurisdictions more recent changes, as I mentioned in Washington, D.C., but in those near neighbors to Connecticut, it's just kind of how it's always been.
What do we know about the impact that we have once we take away the right to vote and how this can really impact incarcerated populations?
Sure. So, for people who are incarcerated, regaining the right to vote, I don't want to speak for individual people because many people have themselves spoken about how important it is for them to feel like it is like they are a member of society and like they have a chance to be kind of reincorporated into civic life after something like a criminal conviction. That's something that we've seen people talk about both in Connecticut, but also in a range of other states that have recently made these kinds of changes, extending the right to vote. So certainly, I think there's room for this to be very important for individual people who will have their right to vote restored. There are still, as I mentioned, kind of practical questions about how people then get to actually access that right. Having the legal right to vote may not be the only barrier people face. There may still be a number of logistical challenges in getting to exercise that, and also questions of habit and whether people find it worthwhile to vote, whether they trust that their vote will actually count. But absolutely, there is this kind of personal component of still seeing oneself as a member of society who can contribute to things like making publicly important decisions.
And one of the articles that I was able to read from our producer, Meg Dalton, that you put me on before this conversation, there was an argument in one of them that this is the best opportunity that somebody that's incarcerated would have to change their situation in prison. Is that correct? Is that something that you look at in terms of why this is so impactful, having the right to vote?
Well, I mean, certainly it is a chance to kind of imagine oneself as I said, as contributing to society, or taking part in something bigger than oneself. There's been, I would say, some correlational evidence about whether people who vote are also going to have better outcomes when they come out, as far as, things like not ending up with additional charges or convictions. We have less evidence there, I would say, but certainly that's, I think, plausible and something that people have raised on this issue.
We can't talk about this without bringing up race, because we know that there's a disproportionate number of black and brown folks in prisons. How does race play into all this?
Yes, well, across the country and also specifically in Connecticut, we definitely see that the weight of felony disenfranchisement laws falls disproportionately on people of color. Because, at nearly every stage of contact with the legal system, it's the case that we see Black and Latino people being overrepresented in the legal system. And so when we get to that stage of disenfranchisement due to, sentences due to prison time, we similarly see Black and Hispanic residents of Connecticut being just more exposed to the loss of voting rights than we see for white residents. So there absolutely is this disparate exposure to felony disenfranchisement, both nationally and here in Connecticut.
You mentioned this already, but I want to talk more about voter engagement in prison. What do we know about the impact of incarcerated people on electoral outcomes?
Yes, I would say both nationwide and particularly in Connecticut, when thinking about restoring the right to vote to people in prison, to the extent people are wondering whether, newly enfranchised people would be kind of a large voting bloc that would change election outcomes in this case. I don't think there's reason to expect that. And you were talking about restoring the vote to about 6,000 or so people in a state with millions of registered voters. So while this is something that has room to be personally very important for the people who regain the right to vote, there's not a lot of reason to expect that this would be changing the outcome of elections, particularly since in places where we do see people having the right to vote while incarcerated, we don't see them necessarily using that right at the same rates as we see people outside of prison voting. I also would note here that people with convictions, people serving time in prison, when they do vote, this is not a group of people who is politically monolithic. So, in studies of registration and of voting among people who have past convictions and get their right to vote restored, we don't see this group registering like overwhelmingly with the Democratic Party in the way that I think people sometimes expect. So, adding all of these things up, both the size of the population, the participation rates, and also the fact that people are not consistently, always voting with one party, I just think there's a much less clear electoral implication than people sometimes imagine when making changes like this to election law.
So to sum it up very succinctly and to do this quickly, this is not necessarily about expecting that it's going to have some kind of electoral outcome. This is a small population. It's more about allowing someone to exercise their civic duty.
Yeah, I think there's room for the people of Connecticut here to think about what they think the rights of citizenship are, what comes with them, and whether they think voting rights ought to be extended to everyone, regardless of convictions, or whether they think that voting rights are something that should be suspended at the time of a conviction or serving a sentence, as something, that's essentially just a question about what they think is right, how they think citizenship should operate, not so much about the kind of purported electoral effects, because those are not likely to be large here.
Thank you for bringing up the people of Connecticut, because I wanted to go next to the Secretary of State in Connecticut, Stephanie Thomas. She's not in favor of a proposal floated last year in the Connecticut General Assembly to extend the franchise to incarcerated people, citing logistical challenges.
With the Department of Corrections and some other stakeholders to try to figure out how to solve all those pain points. And I think that will help any other conversations move forward if we can solve those issues.
Pain points, issues, logistical challenges. What do you make of what Thomas said there?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned up top, there are real practical questions about how you implement a change like this. And so there's definitely room in any legislative proposal to check in with the stakeholders, to check in with the state agencies who would end up needing to implement a change like this, to make sure that they have the tools that they need to do it. These are not insurmountable barriers. They're things that other states and jurisdictions do. But it is absolutely worth planning and addressing.
And more precisely, in Connecticut, they're considering, I guess the issue was absentee ballots and that process and residences and the like for people that are in prison. And now they're talking about potentially in the future having it so that people can vote in prison and that there would be a voting station there.
And these are absolutely all approaches that we have seen taken in other parts of the U.S., whether it's for people in jail in Cook County in Chicago, where they've set up polling places, or Harris County in Texas, or as in Maine and Vermont, where people send in their ballots and they register at their previous home address. There are certainly different approaches that can be taken here, learning from other jurisdictions if the state decides to put together a change like this.
Ariel, thank you so much for coming on the program this morning. It was a very insightful conversation that we had about allowing incarcerated people the right to vote, people that are currently incarcerated the right to vote. I appreciate you coming on. Ariel White, the Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Coming up, we're breaking down the need for new voting machines in the state. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Great conversation. A ballot bonanza, if you will, this morning, set up by our producer, Meg Dalton. I appreciate it very much. We talked about attempts to disqualify Donald Trump from the presidency, extending the franchise to people who are currently incarcerated in prison, and now we're going to try to answer a multi-million-dollar question, quite literally. Earlier this year, lawmakers approved a bill allowing the state to borrow more than $25 million to replace aging voting equipment. But so far, the funding is MIA. Governor Ned Lamont and other members of the State Bond Commission, they still got to vote to officially spend the money. For more on this, we got a great guest in studio. To my left, Andrew Brown, the investigative reporter for the Connecticut Mirror.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. And Andrew, relatively new to Connecticut. In the last couple of years, you've now started covering politics and the right to vote in Connecticut. And man, you've come here at quite a really interesting time.
That's for certain. I don't think anybody would argue with that.
Follow Andrew's work as he's paying attention to what's happening in Bridgeport. We aim to have more information on next week's show about that. So email us if you have any comments at wheelhouse@ctpublic.org. But also pay attention to Andrew Brown's reporting on that in the Connecticut Mirror. There's a question about election interference there in Bridgeport. Moving on to this conversation, I want to ask you just quite broadly, what does election infrastructure look like in Connecticut?
Yeah, so Connecticut's voting infrastructure is largely based still around a paper ballot, which many elections officials across the country are kind of coming back to now. Connecticut never left. They used to have the lever machines back in the early 2000s that people would actually pull to cast their votes. And in the mid-2000s, they went to people filling out a paper ballot and then putting it into a machine called a tabulator that counts the votes. The paper ballot remains, but it allows people, essentially election workers, to efficiently on election night count everyone's vote as they're showing up to the polls. That is what the election infrastructure looks like. And those tabulators, those boxes that you see at the polling stations, those are the backbone of how Connecticut officials count your votes.
Kind of looks like a fax machine or like a copy machine.
Right, an old fax machine sitting there. So, I'm again relatively new. I've been in Connecticut 2 years, but went to the polls in West Hartford. They had me, you feed your ballot into the machine.
And I'm
once you're
somebody
done.
that's going to fill the heck out of that circle to make sure that I didn't leave any space in there. Hey, what's really wrong with this current election equipment that we have in our state, and why is it time to replace it now, according to lawmakers?
So I've talked to several registrar of voters in who run these machines on election day in the various towns and cities. Their main concern in recent years has been that the voting machines that the state helped them acquire in 2006 and 2007 are essentially reaching the end of their useful life. The manufacturer of those machines is no longer in business. So the real concern is that if machines break down, they may not have the spare parts immediately available to fix them on site. That what I've been told is from the Secretary of the State and these registrar of voters is that the state of Connecticut is essentially cannibalizing older machines that came from other states at this point, using contractors to maintain the machines. But again, the concern is that since these are so integral to the state's elections and the voting systems, if they start to break down, there could be, delays at the polls or delays in the vote count that could slow up the election results, which, again, people want to see quick election results. That's just modern America, right? We want to know in a couple
Trust,
hours.
integrity.
Right. And so people see these machines as very important to that.
Well, you mentioned that their vendor that they use no longer being around. That's going to be very important. You're kind of talking about alluding to that request for proposal kind of process that we're going to talk about in a second. After a news conference in Hartford last week, Governor Ned Lamont asked if the state would come through with funding for voting machines. In this exchange with Republican-American reporter Paul Hughes, Lamont pointed to a state bond commission meeting in October.
We're going to get it done in the bond commission, and we're going to get it done in time for the next election.
You're going to get it done in time for the presidential preference primary? That seems to be the main concern.
I think so.
So will this be done in September or October?
I think the next bonding is in early October, if I'm not mistaken. And by the way, these voting machines have worked pretty well for the last 25 years, but we're going to get the new ones in place.
What's been the holdup with the $25 million to purchase the new equipment and train poll workers?
It's just the system of how Connecticut approves borrowing of money. I think most people, everybody focuses on the legislature whenever it's in session, and a lot of press releases are sent out, and lawmakers put out social media posts about the things they got money for. Well, sometimes all that is an approval for the state to borrow money. And it's ultimately not the state lawmakers' decision of when that money is borrowed. That rests with the state bond commission, and the governor clearly holds those purse strings. He sits on there with several of high-up officials in his administration, as well as the treasurer, the attorney general, the state comptroller. And until an item makes the agenda and is voted on, they're not issuing the funds for that, whatever expenditure that is. And so that bond commission only meets every couple months. They can hold special meetings. There was a meeting in July post-session, but the election equipment and the tabulator funding was not on there.
In that cut, he's saying that they'll talk about it in October. You're saying from your reporting and following at least what he said that means they should be taking care of it next. And you hear earlier in that clip, Governor Lamont saying that voting machines have worked pretty well for the last 25 years here. It sounded a little sassy there, the governor. I asked the state's top election official, Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, about this. Here's what she said.
I used to drive an old car. It got me from point A to point B, but it had a awful oil leak. There were parts I couldn't even get at the junkyard. The passenger door wouldn't open, so people had to get in on the other side and scooch over, and it had no air conditioning. We definitely have methods in place to make sure all of our elections are secure, even if there are malfunctions with the tabulators. But do we really want, as a state, to be using election equipment that functions like an old car cobbled together with junkyard parts?
Full transparency, because I fancy myself a real journalist. After Stephanie Thomas said that to me, I told her, you just gave me a soundbite, and I thanked her for it. And I also wanted to play that because I wanted to see the look on your face, Andrew Brown, when she said that. An old car cobbled together with junkyard parts. We talked about the condition of these machines, but I want you to give us the thoughts about what she said and the condition of our machines and these efforts overall.
I've never repaired one of these machines, but what I've been told by some registrars of voters, I've heard that analogy before, right? The car is functioning, it's working, but whenever you take it out on the highway, election day, and you start really, running the engine, there can be breakdowns, and there have been breakdowns in one of the more recent municipal primary elections. There were, machines overheated, including in Middletown, other places, other municipalities. And so they couldn't feed ballots into these machines because they were overheating, they were breaking down. And what that results in, I think you heard the Secretary of the State say there, is, the integrity of the vote isn't compromised fully because there's paper ballots. You can hand count these things. It's about the efficiency of our elections, right? I don't think anyone out here would say that it's efficient to be counting hundreds of ballots, especially in a high turnout election like the presidential election. So I think that's really the point. It's a question of, do you want to take the risk of having an election, especially something like the presidential election, where maybe one or two municipalities end up having to revert back to a hand count?
And that could create trust and integrity. This is either way you're going to talk about trust and integrity. If you have a machine breaking down in Middletown, or you're in a situation where you're kind of less efficient and you're talking about taking more time to count ballots. But just help me with this process and try to do it for a minute, because I want to ask you about the presidential election 2024 in a second. What happens once the state gets that okay to borrow the money to purchase the tabulators? There's the RFP process. Take me from, I guess, here to the August primaries next year.
So what I've been told by the Secretary of the State is that just like any type of government spending where you're spending millions of dollars, they're going to go and solicit requests or proposals from election manufacturers. There are only a handful of companies really in the country who produce election equipment of this sort. So they're going to, I assume, go out and solicit that information from them about like what the cost would be, what are the features of these new ballot tabulators that they may want. And then they'll make a decision after reviewing all of that. That's not the end of the process. Once they purchase the equipment, the Secretary of the State is overseeing the state's elections, but they're not the ones running them, right? The registrar of voters in each town and city are the people and their volunteers and their staff. They're the ones that are at the polls actually working with this equipment. So those people need to be brought in, need to be trained on this new equipment, how it works, how the results get posted, and that takes time. It's like any infrastructure, right? Human infrastructure is the same as technological infrastructure. You have to make sure that the staff knows how to use these things so that there aren't mistakes on election night.
And it's the state's understanding that the vendor that they choose with the tabulators is going to do that training, but we're going to have to see for that. I don't know if that's exactly official yet. We got about just a minute left, maybe less. What do you think this all means ahead of 2024? Is anything likely to change before we vote for our next president, I guess either in the primary or the general?
This upcoming general election for the municipal races in November won't be changed. You're going to be casting the ballots on the same machines that have been around. But if Lamont and the Bond Commission approve this funding, I suspect we will see the money come in, and I suspect that there will be a big push to get this out the door.
Big thanks to Andrew Brown from the CT Mirror for joining us. I appreciate it very much. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton, technical producer Kat Pastor. Thank you so much to Tess Terrible for helping us in studio today. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.